The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked pavement outside Rusty's diner when Sheriff Dale Rourke spotted the boy crouched between a row of parked motorcycles, working a thick steel chain loose from a front tire. The chain clinked heavily against the asphalt as the boy moved with careful hands. "Well now," Rourke called out, voice loud enough to turn heads inside the diner. "What exactly do you think you're doing, son?" Jalen Carter looked up slowly, blinking against the light. "Just unlock them, sir. I was asked to." The sheriff chuckled, adjusting his hat as a few customers drifted outside. "Asked to? You playing hero today? Or just trying to look tough in front of the crowd?" A couple of men laughed. Jalen stood, slim, shoulder-squared but respectful. "Mr. Lawson told me to clear the chains." "Mr. Lawson?" Rourke smirked. "By who? The Tooth Fairy?" More chuckles. Jalen didn't answer. He simply bent back down to his work, jaw tight, hands steady. What they didn't know was this wasn't mischief. And 20 minutes later, the sound that rolled over that parking lot wasn't laughter anymore. Jalen Carter was 16 years old. Though most days he carried himself like someone much older. He lived in a small white house at the edge of town with his grandmother. The porch, sagging slightly on one side, wind chimes singing whenever the breeze came through. Since his father's death, that house had grown quieter, heavier. 2 years earlier, Marcus Chief Carter had been leading a memorial ride for a fallen veteran when a distracted driver crossed the line on a stretch of open highway. The accident made state news for a day, then it faded. But in Jalen's world, time split clean in two. Before that ride and after, Marcus wasn't just another biker in worn leather. He was the founder of the Iron Brotherhood Riders, a nationwide club known for raising money for wounded veterans, rebuilding homes after hurricanes, and escorting grieving families who had no one else to stand beside them. To thousands of riders across the country, he was simply Chief. To Jalen, he was Dad. In the bottom of Jalen's backpack, wrapped carefully in a folded t-shirt, were his father's old leather gloves, creased, scarred, and still faintly smelling of engine oil. He carried them everywhere, though he never spoke about why. He worked part-time at Rusty's diner, cleared tables without complaint, kept his head down. When Mr. Lawson asked him to unlock the chains that afternoon to prepare for a scheduled memorial ride, he simply nodded. Sheriff Rourke didn't know any of that, and the sheriff had a history of assuming he knew everything. Sheriff Rourke had built his reputation on being the loudest voice in the room. Over the years, out-of-town bikers learned to expect a traffic stop before they reached Main Street. He called them gangs on wheels, said it with a grin like it was a harmless joke. Folks laughed because it was easier than disagreeing. He believed in order, his order, and anyone who didn't fit neatly into it, especially someone young, quiet, and easy to overlook, became a lesson waiting to happen. "Where'd you get the key?" he demanded now, stepping closer to Jalen. The badge on his chest caught the sun. His hand rested casually near his gun belt. "You think you're in charge of something?" Jalen straightened, backpack hanging from one shoulder, worn sneakers dusty from the lot. "No, sir. Mr. Lawson gave it to me. Said they're expecting riders." Rourke snorted. "Expecting riders. That so?" He looked at the small gathering crowd. "Since when does Rusty start taking orders from kids?" A few uneasy chuckles drifted through the air. "I'm just doing what I was asked," Jalen replied, voice steady, eyes lowered but not defeated. The sheriff stepped between him and the bikes. "You can step away now. I'll handle it." The command wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The weight of it pressed down all the same, badge against backpack, gun belt against worn sneakers, authority towering over quiet obedience. And then, the ground started to vibrate. At first it was subtle, more felt than heard, a faint vibration beneath the soles of their shoes. Glass in the diner windows trembled lightly. A fork slid across a plate inside. Sheriff Rourke turned his head toward the highway. "Hear that?" he muttered. The sound grew, rolling low across the hills like distant thunder. Not one engine, not two, dozens, then hundreds. A steady, synchronized rumble that swallowed conversation whole. Rourke exhaled through his nose, a crooked smile forming. "Well," he said, adjust his hat. "Looks like the circus just rolled into town." People stepped out from the diner, shading their eyes. Phones appeared in hands. The vibration deepened until it pressed against ribs and settled in chests. But Jalen didn't flinch. He reached into his backpack calmly, almost reverently, and pulled out a pair of worn leather gloves. The creases were dark with age, the knuckles scarred from years of riding. He slipped them on slowly, tightening each finger with care. Sheriff Rourke noticed. His smile faded just a fraction. Why isn't the boy scared? The rumble grew louder, closer, filling every inch of space, because this wasn't chaos. It was a procession. They came over the ridge in waves. Chrome flashed in the afternoon sun as an endless line of motorcycles poured into town, stretching farther down Main Street than anyone could see. Harleys and cruisers moved in tight formation, engines rumbling in deep, unified rhythm. Leather vests bore stitched patches, Purple Hearts, firefighter insignias, military unit numbers. American flags rose from sissy bars, snapping crisply in the wind, no weaving, no revving for show, just order. The riders turned into the diner lot, as if rehearsed, filling spaces with precision. Kickstands dropped almost in unison. Engines cut one by one until the thunder softened into a heavy, waiting silence. Sheriff Rourke's jaw tightened. This wasn't a circus. It was a statement. He scanned the sea of riders, suddenly aware of how small his department-issued SUV looked at the edge of the lot. Conversations in the crowd faded to whispers. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Then the lead motorcycle rolled forward and stopped near the front. The rider removed his helmet slowly, dark hair streaked with gray, steady eyes, a familiar patch stitched over his heart. Daniel Reyes, national president of the Iron Brotherhood Riders. Rourke straightened instinctively, preparing to assert control, but Reyes didn't even glance at him. He stepped past the sheriff, as though he were a lamppost on the sidewalk. Every eye followed him. Reyes walked directly toward Jalen. The crowd parted without being asked. Silence fell so completely that the ticking of cooling engines sounded like a clock counting down. And what he says next flips the entire town upside down. Daniel Reyes stopped a few feet in front of Jalen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of hot engines cooling under the sun. Then Reyes removed his riding gloves, slowly, deliberately, and held them in both hands. He stepped closer and extended them toward the teenager, standing in worn sneakers and his father's old leather. His voice carried across the lot without needing to rise. "We've been waiting for you, Chief." The word landed like a bell struck in a quiet church. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Sheriff Rourke blinked. Certain he had misheard, Reyes turned slightly so everyone could see Jalen's face. 2 years ago, your father made us promise something, he said. He said when his boy turned 16, we were to ride together again. Not in mourning, in honor. Jalen swallowed, eyes shining but steady. He didn't ask us to hand over responsibility, Reyes continued. He asked us to recognize legacy, to remind this young man that leadership isn't about noise, it's about service. Reyes gestured toward the heavy chains lying slack on the pavement. Those chains weren't just security, they were a symbol. Today, Jalen unlocked them, just like his father unlocked doors for veterans, for families, for strangers who needed someone to stand beside them. A murmur of understanding moved through the onlookers. This ride was planned months ago, Reyes said. Every mile for this moment. Then, without command, riders began removing their helmets, one by one. 2,000 faces revealed, weathered, disciplined, reverent. In perfect unity, they raised their right hands. Chief, the word rolled across the lot, deep and unified, not shouted in anger, spoken in honor. Sheriff Rourke stood frozen, the earlier laughter still hanging in the air like a memory no one wanted. And that's when the sheriff realized the badge on his chest felt very small. Sheriff Rourke cleared his throat, the sound thin against the silence that still hovered over the lot. He adjusted his hat, tugged at his belt, searching for the steady confidence that usually came so easily. Well, he muttered, forcing a tight smile, nobody told me all that. I didn't know. The words felt small even as he said them. Daniel Reyes met his eyes. Not hostile, not triumphant, just steady. Respect doesn't require knowing someone's title, he replied calmly. It just requires giving it. A few townspeople shifted uncomfortably. The same men who had chuckled minutes earlier now stared at the pavement. No one laughed. No one stepped in to rescue the sheriff from the weight of the moment. Rourke glanced at Jalen, then at the sea of riders standing in disciplined silence. Authority, for once, offered him no shield. He took a slow step back. Then another. No one cheered. No one jeered. The reckoning wasn't loud. It was public and undeniable, but the most powerful moment wasn't the salute. As the riders began preparing for the procession through town, Jalen stepped away from the crowd and walked toward Sheriff Rourke. There was no swagger in his stride, no trace of victory in his expression, just the same steady calm he'd carried all afternoon. The sheriff looked older up close. Jalen stopped a respectful distance away. "Sir," he said gently, "my dad always told me respect is earned both ways." There was no edge in his voice, no accusation. Rourke swallowed and gave a small nod. I reckon he was right. At their feet, one of the heavy chains lay twisted where it had been dropped. Jalen bent down and lifted one end. After a brief hesitation, the sheriff reached for the other. Together they carried it aside. No applause, no announcement, just a quiet act of grace that spoke louder than anything else that day. When the engine started again, they did so with purpose, not noise. The procession rolled out of the diner lot in slow formation, 2 by 2, chrome glinting beneath the afternoon sun. American flags lifted high above the riders, rippling against a wide blue sky. People lined Main Street, some of the same faces that had watched in silence earlier, but something had shifted. The cautious curiosity was gone. In its place stood quiet respect. Mr. Lawson from the diner wiped his eyes with the back of his hand as the lead bike eased past. Store owners stepped out onto sidewalks. A veteran removed his cap and held it to his chest. At the front of the procession rode Jalen. He didn't rev the engine for attention. He didn't wave like a celebrity. He sat steady, gloved hands firm on the handlebars, eyes forward, posture calm. The patch bearing his father's insignia rested over his heart. From mocked boy in worn sneakers to honored leader at the head of 2,000 riders. The contrast spoke for itself. In small towns and big cities alike, it happens every day. We look at someone and think we understand their story. We measure worth by posture, by clothing, by titles stitched on a uniform or missing from one. How often do we judge by appearance? How often do we mistake quiet strength for weakness? Sheriff Rourke had a badge. Jalen had a backpack. One commanded attention, the other carried legacy. And in the end, it wasn't volume or authority that defined leadership. It was character. True authority doesn't shout. True legacy doesn't need permission. Sometimes the people we underestimate are the very ones holding communities together. Sometimes they're the ones carrying the heaviest chains and the strongest keys. Maybe you've seen it yourself. Maybe you've lived it. Have you ever watched someone be underestimated, only to rise in a way no one expected? Share your story below, and if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, subscribe for more stories that remind us what real justice looks like.